Hello, everybody. It's that time again to go through this week's group curriculum guidance. We're going to be in the study questions for session number 5. And there's a longer text today. This is going through the whole Jerusalem Council text. So take your time, do the work up front, try to make some observations yourself as you go through the text. And that way you'll be able to better choose questions based on your group and so forth, okay? All right, we're going to start on page 47, question number 1. What are all the things that circumcision indicates for an Israelite? Why is this such a big deal for both sides? So circumcision was, for an Israelite, it's how you became an Israelite in essence, right? So if you were born into basically Israel, you, by the 8th day, a male would be circumcised on the 8th day. And then basically, if you were an outsider of Judaism, you could come into Judaism by becoming circumcised. Those are the things that were like, it was the entry point. And behind it were, oh man, by doing so, you're kind of saying, apart from the 8-day-old child, you're saying, I am a part of this people and this is the law we have and so forth, right? So it was this way to become a part of the ethnic Israel community and their religious system, right? So it kind of, all of that was all swirling around this one thing, right? So you could talk about it and think about how that would have an implication for those as you come to this point, because the big decision today is, okay, what do we do? This is what the leadership is deciding. What do we do when a person says yes to Jesus? Are they having to do all of the Old Testament the way a Jew would have to do, a Judean Israelite? That's what they would do, right? Do they have to do all of that, or is it something different? So think about the tensions on both sides of this argument. If I have to do this thing that I don't have, what does it mean to me? If I don't have to do this thing that identifies me to the rest of the nations of the world, what does that mean? You see, that's where the question's getting at. Question number 2, read Matthew 5:17 and 18 and Luke 24:44 through 45. What is meant by fulfilled and accomplished in these verses? Who fulfilled and accomplished? What are the implications for the law, and how might it speak to what is happening at the Jerusalem Council? So when you think of these words, it's important to recognize that there's kind of, think of it kind of this way. This is maybe oversimplistic, but there are two ways something can end. You can either just destroy the thing that existed, or you can complete it, right? Both those are endings, right? And I think it's that second one that we're talking about. The law wasn't bad. It wasn't something that was destroyed. It was something that was fulfilled. It was accomplished. Jesus did it. And it's using that very line in the sand to say, well, then what happens? What happens when someone wants to come to Jesus? Are they having to go back and do the law? Right? All of the Israelite law, including the kosher law and all of those things and so forth. So circumcision is kind of, think of it as this symbol of all of it in a sense. So think about what's happening there and think of why this would be so important at this Jerusalem Council, because I think we might underestimate, like, what's the big deal? No, it's a big deal. It's a big deal, and it has huge ramifications on what a life looks like post, right, for a Gentile, post coming to Jesus. Are they coming to Jesus, or are they coming to actual Judaism, right? And there is a difference. Question number 3, what is Peter referring to in Acts 15:7 through 9? What does Peter appeal to as his primary argument? Why was Peter essential to this discussion? This is a pretty easy question. It's just going back and saying, hey, this was his encounter with Cornelius, right? And if he's speaking back and talking about, hey, you know about this situation that happened to me, how God had called me into this particular work. And I think that's the key, is that God's the one who did it. It's the Spirit of the living God who actually gave the Spirit. He gave himself to the Gentiles. The Spirit came down on the Gentiles. Peter didn't, he was halfway through his speech in the way it's told the first time, and the Spirit of the living God just kind of descends on them. So the very same thing that had happened in Judea to the people who were already part of the Israelite nation, it happens to them. And now outside to a person who's not a part of the Israelite nation. And now this is happening. I'm sorry, because Cornelius was within the borders of Israel, but he was not an Israelite, right? In fact, he was a representative of a foreign oppressing power. Now you keep going outside. Now you're way outside the borders of Israel. What do you do now? And this is what Peter is getting to, right? So talk about that. Talk about the specifics of his argument. Question number 4. Acts 15, 13 through 18 is a quote from Amos 9, 11, and 12. Read the context in Amos. How is James using this text for his argument? What has changed in the text? If you go back and read the full context of Amos, it's pretty dark. It is very condemning of Israel. And this is kind of that moment where it kind of turns and it's showing how, no, God's not done. He's going to do something there. And you're going to see two things that change specifically. One, it's going to move from the idea of the nations to the word Gentiles, which is fine. I mean, that's kind of makes sense. And then there's another one where it talks of I think it's the descendants of Edom. And in this text, it changes to mankind. Now, there is a potential scribal similarity. So if you think of the word Adam, it's kind of like human. And so you can see how this could be shifted. And it makes all the sense in the world, right? Because Edom was a nation in the Old Testament, basically, that had descended from Esau. So you have this foreign tribe it's talking about outsiders, right? But as he brings it over, he's talking about mankind. But why would this be important? Especially, I mean, if you think of context is everything. It might be helpful to read a good chunk of Amos and see like what leads up to here. But James is using it very particularly. He's saying, no, this is the promise. This was going to happen, right? And then they write the letter. Question number 5. Even though they decide that circumcision is unnecessary, what are the rules that the leadership say the Gentile converts should still follow? Why these rules? What might these rules have in common? We're going to get further into this in a bit, but the important thing is there's 4 things, kind of 3, but 4, right? There's, no idolatry, no sexual immorality, no eating blood, and no eating animals that have been strangled. And all of these do have something in common, right? They all they're part of what a pagan who is worshiping a pagan god would probably do as part of the worship. So I know idolatry, you can't worship other gods. Okay, that's simple. But what would happen in these temples? Well, there'd be temple prostitutes and things like that. What else would happen? There'd be feasts, and they would eat blood, or they'd eat animals that were strangled for the god. So you have you can't operate like a pagan anymore. We're not saying you need to be fully Jewish and be circumcised, but you can't operate like a pagan. Now, that leaves kind of a gap in here, and I think we'll get to that as we get to the other questions. But the key is when you see this list, there might be part of you that's going like, hey, it seems like there's a lot of stuff that kind of could be missing here, okay? Question number 6. Do you think some rules got accidentally left out? Explain. That's what I was getting at. I want you to talk about this because there's simple things, right? Like, do not murder, right? There's just think of kind of the 10 commandments, right? Which I think we would all agree. And most cultures agree with kind of samples from the 10 commandments, like the list, right? Don't kill, don't steal, don't, steal the wife of your neighbor. But I want you to think, there's 2 ways to think about this. One is that this was literally, it's not the elders laying down the law, the entire, here's how you live as a Christian when you say yes to Jesus. That's not really what the law was intended to do. It was actually intended more of how is it we can have Jew and Gentile Christian come together and share a table, right? Because if the table has been sullied by pagan worship and pagan food and all of those things, then a Jew who's operating as a Jew, a righteous Jew, would say, no, I can't have table fellowship, okay? So there's that. Then the other thing to consider is that technically, I just want to say technically, when you think of idolatry, and you think of sexual immorality, those are actually what I'll call, those are the two major, what would you call, accusations of Yahweh of his people in the Old Testament. When he would say that Israel is failing, when a prophet would say that Israel is failing, it's saying you are being an adulterer. And he's not saying that they're necessarily being like they're going out and sleeping with other people. Well, that's part of it. But the bigger thing is idolatry is adultery. That when you are, so basically what they'd be challenged with is, hey, you're being an adulterer and you're being an idolater. Those are things that Israel was being challenged with, that Yahweh was saying, hey, the Lord of Israel, the God of Israel was saying, you are doing these two things. These are the problems. There's idolatry and adultery, and they're wrapped up tightly together. And I think that's part of this, and that if you really, really, really think about it, when sin happens, and let's talk about the simplest sin, let's say murder. When you kill someone, if you're, when you murder someone, when you take someone's life and you're not supposed to, that makes sense. Okay, I want to make sure we're not just saying do not kill. It's specifically more associated with the idea of murder. I'm lying in wait or whatever, right? I am actually going to take someone out, not because I'm stopping evil necessarily. It's because maybe there's a jealousy or vengefulness. You get what I'm saying? When you do that, is your heart truly submitted to the King of the universe, right? Is there not an idolatry in there? And let's think about sexual sin. When you are getting exactly what you want, when you want it, right? If it be for pleasure or for whatever reason that's outside of a godly reason, are you not being an idolater, right? Now, this is oversimplified and it's hard to make it exhaustive, but I just want you to see that I think built into here, there's a possibility that it is laying the groundwork, the foundation for what does it look like to be a Christian? Well, what it looks like to be a Christian is not to be an idolater. You can't worship other gods, right? And you have to have a pure sexual ethic, right? And the whole idea of blood and strangling, again, those are like, of course you wouldn't do that. Those are things that the pagans do. So it all revolves around these ideas of not being an idolater, but also being faithful, right? Sexual sin is usually, it's just tied to unfaithfulness. So if you think about it, if I'm not to worship another god and I'm to be faithful, those are the two sides of the same thing, kind of, you see? So anyway, I'll let you kind of hunt that down. Question number 7. Where is the first mention of not eating blood in the Bible? Why might this be important? If you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, in chapter 9, this is Noah and the flood, and there's this covenant that's cut with Noah. And he basically says, before you had all the trees, and think of it this way, Adam and Eve had a kind of a vegetarian diet. Now it's opened up saying, hey, all of creation is under your submission, but it does have this one caveat: you're never to eat the blood, right? And there's this idea also of blood guilt, like if you take someone's life, your life will be taken. You see, there's this idea that kind of comes up here. Question number 8. Read Leviticus 17 and 18. Looking for the main prohibitions. Look at what follows the words strangers or sojourners and discuss the main point of the 2 chapters. How does it compare to the prohibitions here in Acts? So it's a good amount of reading. I want you to read super carefully. This reading is going to give you kind of one view into how this letter from the Jerusalem Council kind of narrowed on these items. You'll see that there are laws for the Israelite, and there are laws for even the people and the strangers and sojourners that are among you. And I want you to make special note of those and kind of collect them, okay? And you'll see that it's very close to what this list is pointing to, right? There are certain things that the punishment would be the same, whether you are an Israelite or a non-Israelite operating in Israelite line, under, let's call it under Israelite authority, so to speak, right? So look through that and see how it compares. Question number 9, what did Paul and Barnabas do on their way back to Jerusalem? What did they do when they returned with the council's letter? Why were they encouraged? Have you ever experienced this kind of encouragement from someone? Explain. So if you look at kind of the bookends of the story, you see that Paul and Barnabas, they come across this confrontation with some elders that are saying, hey, no, you have to be circumcised. So they're like, well, we're going to go back to Jerusalem and have a discussion then, right? That's how this all starts. And you see that they go through two areas noted, right? They pass through both Phoenicia and Samaria, describing in detail, basically proclaiming, here's what's been happening. The Spirit of the living God is changing the hearts of people all over, not just in Israel. Paul and Barnabas are like, they're proclaiming the goodness of what God is doing in their midst. They're excited about it. And if you notice afterward, the point of the letter being sent back, is Paul and Barnabas with the two representatives from the Jerusalem Council go to Antioch, which has become this new kind of hub, original hub of Christianity outside of Israel. And they're there to encourage them and say, do you see what's happening? Right? So there's this constant, Paul and Barnabas are constantly telling the story of what God is doing in their midst, right? That's powerful. Do we do that enough? Boy, there's a little side note. And the point of telling this letter is like, it's removing obstacles. And Paul and Barnabas know it. And they're like, look, we can keep doing this goodness that we've seen God blessing. So we're going to keep going. And there's this encouragement, a mutual encouragement, and a strengthening that happens even from the other two that came from the Jerusalem Council. They're trying to strengthen Antioch and make sure they're ready and see that this is good stuff. That's powerful stuff that happens. So think about this. How have you maybe experienced this type of encouragement or strengthening? Maybe in your faith, maybe there's a story that someone in your group might have where you could just share, like, I remember this happening when someone was telling me a story of what's going on in the midst, or maybe going on in the mission field that we're supporting or whatever. And it gave me this extra measure of fuel and readiness to go on and do the same thing, to proclaim the same name in just my little area, right? So take some time to look through that. Question number 10, in Acts 15:28, there was a desire to place no greater burden than the stated requirements. Have you ever thought your faith was a burden? What made it so? Explain. So part of this was removing one of the obstacles that before the gospel, right? Is like there's this obstacle of, oh no, they're going to need to do this extra thing. It's not just the good news of Jesus. They've got to actually get circumcised. Well, that's now been removed. Right, and now we're moving forward, and the language used is no. We don't want to put any more burden, no greater burden, right? No more burden on you. But I think sometimes we in our faith start to think of it like a burden, and I want you to talk about that. Maybe there have been times when you felt like your faith was a burden. And I'm not talking about a burdensome time, right? There are times that we go through more chaos and struggles in our life. That is burdensome. What I'm saying is when your faith was a burden. And I'd like to talk about that because in some ways it's expected, but at the same time, that burden should not be very long. There's just this, the New Testament talks about suffering for God's glory and joy that we should have in the middle of it and things like that. And the question is when we reach affliction, when we come upon this thing that associated with our faith, we're having difficulty. Maybe it's in our church body. Maybe it's in a conflict in a marriage or in a relationship within the church or something. How is it we deal with those burdens? Because if we're holding on to them, that doesn't seem right either. And this leads to tending the fire section, which really just gets down to, and I loved the words that Pastor Isaac used. He used this word saying there is no neutral space. The issue is in our culture, this letter that the Jerusalem Council wrote was basically saying you can't continue in your pagan worship ways. Well, we don't have temples per se. We're not necessarily eating animals that were sacrificed to another god or strangled to that god. We do have sexual immorality a lot, and you have to think about, but that's the one that's probably the entryway to really understanding that we do this thing. We do have these things that I would say that are like pagan worship. They are pagan worship-like. There is no neutral space. That in reality, when we offer toward our own comforts and our own desires, oftentimes we are just acting like a pagan. We're acting like someone who doesn't worship Jesus. We're acting like someone who doesn't submit everything that we have to the God of the Bible. We're looking like something different. We look like we worship something different. And this is why those two things, idolatry, which is idolatry, and sexual immorality, which if you think about adultery, which is just in marriage, but just saying sexual sin, which is unfaithfulness, and idolatry. So unfaithfulness is I am not being faithful to the one who made me. Idolatry is I'm worshiping someone else than the one who made me. Those both, I mean, you see how they're the same kind of. When I start to, in my life, everything around me is to serve me, then I look more like I'm worshiping the god Ares or the god Eros or the god, you see, god Mars, the god Zeus, the god Jupiter. I just named the same god 3 ways sometimes. Anyway, so, but you get what I'm getting at. You don't have to go to a pagan temple or have a shrine in your living room to look like a pagan idolater. All you need to do is just start doing all the things that you want to do the way you want them, you see? This is what we're asking. This is what we're trying to get you to look at is, do you realize that sometimes you are worshiping other things than God? And that usually comes down to your own comforts. It usually comes down to your own desires, your own pleasures, and so forth. Do you realize you're doing that? Because this is a time to be looking for those things. Identify those areas where you find yourself falling into that. So for example, let me just give you a quick example. Some of you may work out in a gym, and you probably don't do it with your spouse if you're married. And let's just say you're not married even. Do you think that a gym could be a very dangerous place for your desires, right? Where everyone is there's more scantily clad. There's mirrors everywhere. And maybe it's not even that you are being sexually attracted to another that you shouldn't be. Maybe it's you are looking in the mirror and you're looking at yourself and you're trying to figure out all the things you need to do to be the perfect you. And you're like, okay, are you starting to look a little bit more pagan than you are Christian? That's the point. Try to find those places in your life, find those patterns, and confess them. Maybe have someone help you. Have someone help you realize, yeah, I'm not just saying give up your gym membership. I'm not doing that. What I'm saying is these are places where the rites and rituals of our culture can look just like pagan ones. There is no neutral ground, do you see? So I pray that this week goes well with you. I pray that you'd press in to the Spirit. I pray that you would be ready and really challenge your group to walk differently, to see that we're called to avoid being idolaters and to avoid sexual, being sexual sin, right? Wanting our own desires all the time the way we want them, right? And that usually comes out in that way. Sometimes it comes out in money as well, and you see. So maybe your business is a place where you realize there are rhythms that you're getting into that seem more pagan than they do Christian, right? A rhythm of pagan worship is, let me collect all of this money so that I can get more, right? Whereas a Christian rhythm would be, let me collect this money. If I'm going to earn this money, then I'm going to give it back. I'm going to be generous with it. I'm going to thank God for it. And I'm going to, not just give to the church, but I'm going to give to others because there's so much. I have such a surplus. Do you see? So have a great week. May God go with you, and we will see you next time.